Hello students, we are going to start the online lecture of the development economics as we have started our chapter population growth and economic development, causes, consequences and controversies. So here this is chapter number 7 of Todaro and Smith book. Uh, in the last lecture we have discussed about the population of Pakistan. It is increasing continuously and the increase in population has adverse effect on the economic growth also because it will create the food shortage, it will create unemployment, poverty, unequal income distribution also. The recent population rate of the country, that is 22 crore, and it is expected that it will be much more higher till 2050. And then I have discussed about the reasons of the increase in population. We have discussed how the population can be reduced and what are the methods used by the Pakistan economy or by the Pakistani government. And we have discussed that there are so many programs has been used or the funding has been collected for this reduction of the population. Today, our topic of discussion is demographic transition, and this demographic transition, this is characterized by the growing population rate and stagnant or the same growth stage, that characterized by high birth rates and death rates through a rapid growth stage with high birth rates and low death rates to a stable low growth stage in which both birth and death rates are low. So demographic transition is actually showing the transformation or shifting the phase. It means from one phase to another phase, like the stage with high birth rate and low death rate to the both low birth and death rates. This is called demographic transition, means birth rate is also low and death rate is also low. In 21st century, obviously there are lot of health facilities nowadays, and because of that health facilities, the death ratios are very low. But there is a question whether the birth rates are going to be lowered down or not. So this is the question of discussion, that the birth rate must be low for reduction of population growth rate and increase of the economic development. So this demographic transition attempts to explain why all developed nations have more or less passed through the same three stages of modern population history. Before their economic modernization, these countries for centuries has stable or very slow growing population. as a resulting of a combination of high birth rate and almost equally high death rates. This was stage 1. Stage 2 began when modernization associated with better public health methods, healthier diets, higher income, and other improvements led to a marked reduction in mortality that gradually raised life expectancy from under 40 years to 60 years. However, the decline in death rates was not immediately accompanied by a decline in fertility. As a result, the growing divergence between high birth rate and falling death rates led to sharp increase in population growth compared to past centuries. Stage 2 thus marks the beginning of the demographic transition. And finally, stage 3 was entered when the forces and influences of modernization and development caused the beginning of decline in fertility. Eventually, falling birth rates converged with lower death rates, leaving little or no population growth. So, here we are explaining the demographic transition, high birth rates and low death rates to a low death rate and low birth rate. When the health facilities are good, so death rates are low. And stage 3 here, where where the low fertility has been started or beginning, and falling the birth rates converged with the lower death rates from stage 1 to stage 3. This is called the demographic transition. Again, I will repeat this, that it is the first stage where we are explaining the high birth rate and low death rate. And whenever we explain the stage 2, it began with modernization associated with better public health methods, higher income, and improvement that has reduced the mortality rate and raised the life expectancy. And in stage 2, we are explaining that decline in death rate was not immediately accompanied by decline in fertility. Okay, this is stage 2. But at the stage 3, whenever you are talking about demographic transition, at stage 3, this low birth rate or low death rate is accompanied by low birth rate that has been shown the reduction in the population growth rate. So this process implies movement from a relatively high number of births per woman to a population replacement fertility level that can be calculated to reach about 2.05 to 2.1 births per woman when nearly all women survive to the mean age of childbearing as they do in developed nations. In developed countries, in developing nations with much lower survival rate, replacement fertility can be well over 3 births per woman. So here we are explaining the replacement fertility, which is showing the number of births per woman that would result in stable population levels. So they are saying about the ratio of replacement fertility means the one woman can give the birth of 3 children in developing nation, and in developed nation it is the ratio of 2.05 or 2.1. So this is the replacement fertility. So here this is showing the ratio of birth per women in different countries. and this shows the actually the replacement fertility of the different nations. Here it is showing. It means how much the women can give birth to the children. It is also showing the birth rate, death rate of the different nations, and it depicts the historical stages of the demographic transitions in Europe. You can also see here. Birth rates in many developing nations today are considerably higher than they were in pre industrial Western Europe. This because women tend to marry at an earlier age. This is the big reason. As a result, there are both more families for a given population size and more years in which to have children. In 1950 and 1960, stage 2 of the demographic transition occurred throughout most of the developing world. The application of highly effective imported modern medical and public health technologies caused death rates in developing countries to fall much more rapidly than in 19th century. These are showing the stages of demographic transition model, and there are 4 or 5 stages, and these are pre-transition, early transition, late transition, post transition. So first of all, we are explaining the pre-transition. As I have explained, this is showing the high birth rates and high fluctuating death rates. Population growth was kept low by Malthusian preventative late age at marriage and positive famine war checks. And second stage is showing early transition. During the early stages of the transition, the death rates begin to fall. As birth rates remain high, the population starts to grow rapidly. Stage 3. Now you can see the birth rates start to decline and the rate of population growth decelerates. It means it has been or it is going to reduce. Post transition societies are characterized by low birth and low death rate. This is actually the demographic transition, and population growth is negligible or even enters a decline. Here are showing the different stages: stage 1, stage 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these are showing the birth and death rates or the demographic transition in 5 different stages. And this is showing the demographic transition of different nations. And you can go through here about some concept of demographic transition.
compare the development of countries, often used indicators, such as average income, concern economic development. Indicators on the level of mortality and birth also tell us something about the development of a country and are therefore useful indicators. Two frequently used indicators are the birth rate and the mortality rate. The birth rate starts with the number of live births in a year. Because there are more people living in one country than in another, more children are probably born in that country. That is why we calculate the birth rate per thousand inhabitants. In this way, countries can be compared. We do this in the following way. The Netherlands had 17 million inhabitants in 2016 and 170,000 babies were born in that year. We divide the number of babies by the number of inhabitants and multiply by thousands to calculate the birth rate. We therefore divide 170,000 by 17 million people and we multiply by thousands. So the birth rate of the Netherlands in 2016 was 10.0. The mortality rate is calculated almost in the same way, but here we share the number of deaths by the inhabitants. In 2016, 150,000 people died in the Netherlands. We divide 150,000 by 17 million and multiply it by thousands, and then it appears that the mortality rate of the Netherlands in 2016 was 8.8. The natural population growth is the difference between the birth and the mortality rate. 10.0 minus 8.8 is 1.2. The natural population growth in the Netherlands in 2016 was therefore 1.2. The birth rate and the mortality rate show us a lot of development in a country, because they develop over time. We can show this development in the demographic transition model. Demos means people and graphically a description. The demographic transition model thus shows us a change in the characteristics of the birth and the mortality rate. We can show the demographic transition model as a graph in which the lines represent the birth rate, the mortality rate and the total population size. The model consists of 5 phases. If a country is very poor and hardly developed, both the birth and the mortality rate will be very high. This is phase 1. The mortality rate can reach 40 and the birth rate even something higher. This means that an average of 40 people die each year per 1,000 inhabitants. That is because the healthcare is still poorly developed. People get a lot of children, so the children can take care of the parents when they're old and there are still few contraceptives available. Nowadays there are actually no countries anymore that meet this description. When a country starts to develop, the quality of the healthcare increases. People are being vaccinated, better doctors and more hospitals are available. This reduces the mortality rate. This is phase 2. Because the birth rate still remains high, there is a huge natural population growth. This increases the total population size. The poorest countries in the world meet this description, such as Angola and Chad. It is important for these countries to continue to develop so that the population growth will decline. In phase 3 there is already a low mortality rate, but also the birth rate declines. Contraceptives are more available, and because child mortality is falling, people need fewer children who can take care of them later. Girls also go to school much longer, which leads to a lower birth rate. Because there is still a big difference between the birth and mortality rate, the population continues to increase, but the increase is declining. Many countries that have developed quite well already meet this description, such as Indonesia, South Africa and Mexico. In phase 4 there is a low birth and mortality rate. The natural population growth is low again, as a result of which the population size hardly grows. Many developed countries meet this description, such as the Netherlands. In phase 5 the mortality rate increases and becomes higher than the birth rate. For the first time in the history of a country it has to do with a natural population decline instead of growth, and so the total population size decreases. This happens when the population is getting older, so that more and more people die. Only a few of the most developed countries meet this description, such as Germany. The demographic transition model helps us to compare the development of countries and shows us which demographic developments a country will experience in the future.
So here it was showing the demographic transition, which we had discussed the 5 stages: pre-transition, early transition, late transition and post-transition. You can see here first of all both um, uh, you can see here the birth rates are high, okay, and high fluctuating death rates. and after that, because the good health facilities, the death rates are going to fall, but the birth rates are also high, so population starts to grow rapidly. And late transition, now the birth rates are going to decline and population will also go to decline, and after that you can see the old population, the mortality rate is going to high and the birth rates are also high, so it will have the effect on the population growth rate. So here, this is another showing the demographic transition.
Created using Powtoon.
So these were the five stages of the demographic transition. Now you have understood what was that. We have explained here actually the five stages, okay, of the demographic transition, and first and second stage applied to the less developed nations, and second and third stage, um, you can say the uh, middle income nations, and then we have discussed the third and fourth stage, okay, um, fourth and fifth stage about the high developed or more developed nations, or more income countries, high income nations. Talk about the high income nations. So here we have discussed the five stages of the demographic transition. Then the topic of interest is the Malthusian and household models. I have discussed about the Malthusian theory in the previous lecture. First of all, I will tell you that this was made by Thomas Malthus, and who says that the population rate will increase by the geometric rate, and the food will increase on the arithmetic rate. That's why there will be the food shortage, and that main idea was postulated in 1798. And he said that population tends to grow at a geometric rate, doubling every 30 to 40 years, and food supplies only expand at an arithmetic rate due to diminishing returns to land, that is fixed factor. And according to them, Malthusian explained the population trap or poverty trap. The countries would be trapped in low per capita income, per capita food and population that would stabilize at a subsistence level. Whenever the population growth rate will increase geometrically, it will create a lot of difference for people's food. It will create the food shortage, uh, and whenever the population will grow at geometric rate, it means doubling every 30 by dwindling or declining food supplies. So it means at the same time it shows the diminishing returns to the fixed factor land. Food supplies could expand only at a arithmetic rate. So here, this is actually the showing Malthus theoretical argument, and according to them, the happiness of a country does not depend absolutely upon its poverty or its richness, upon its youth or its age, upon its being thinly or fully inhabited, but upon the rapidity with which it is increasing, upon the degree in which the yearly increase of food approaches to the yearly increase of an unrestricted population. Happiness of a country depends on how much food is available for all the nation. If the country's population is going to increase, whether they are getting the food or not. So this picture is showing the Malthusian population trap. Okay, so uh, then in the next lecture we will discuss about the implication of the Malthusian model, and then I will discuss about whether it is applicable to the developing nation like Pakistan or not. So what are their criticism or limitations? So here, thanks for your attention.
In order to explain the apparent stagnation of living standards before the Industrial Revolution, we're going to turn to an economist that wrote in the early 19th century named Thomas Malthus. And Malthus's model was basically the idea that living standards unfortunately can't increase in the long run. And the reason for that is that if living standards do increase in the short run, either because there's a good harvest or because there's a new technology, then population expands. And because of the law of diminishing average product of labor, because those additional workers will not be able to produce as much as the earlier workers, then their income will fall. The average product of labor will fall back to where it was before. And living standards will be forced down to the subsistence level, just meaning, people get as much as they need to live, but not much more. And therefore, population and what we now call GDP per capita will stay constant. And this was a powerful idea, a powerful model, and it really does seem to describe the world before the Industrial Revolution. But interestingly, of course, the Industrial Revolution was happening right as Malthus was writing, so that while he was correct for the previous 2,000 years of human existence, and even before then, he was wrong for the next 200 years.
and it's a reason why people like Adam Smith are better known than Thomas Malthus. So what happens if we get an improvement in technology? Basically, he says, all right, well, we have an improvement in technology. It's, even though think of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, there were improvements in technology that happened. Then what happens is that average output per farmer rises, farmers' incomes rise. That means there's more food, and because there's more food, the population rises. And I think one of the things that's important to remember about the world before the Industrial Revolution is that infant mortality was very high. Women died in childbirth all the time. Diseases would kill people all the time. And so more food meant people were healthier, people were stronger, and so population would go up. All right, well, if population goes up, that means there's less land per farmer or less good land per farmer. That means the average output per farmer falls and farmers' incomes fall. And another important thing to remember about this world is that almost everybody is a farmer, right? Almost everybody is spending the bulk of their time growing the food that we need to survive. And so in the short run, we might get this increase in living standards. In the long run, those disappear because of the rise in population. So population goes up, but wages or GDP per capita does not. So if we think about, a Malthusian economy, we can graph this with the real wage on the vertical axis here and population on the horizontal axis. And we can see that, if the wage is high, population is low, but then we're going to get pushed back to a low wage and a medium population. And we can think about that in terms of population growth as well, that as when the real wage is higher, population is growing faster. When the real wage is lower, population is falling because people don't have enough food to eat, people are dying faster. And so what we're going to see when we look at some of this data is that, A is sort of an equilibrium, right, whereas B is an outlier. So if we're at A and we get pushed up to B because of the new technology, then population rises and the real wage is going to fall back to subsistence level. So what happens? How can we think about this? Well, a new technology, right, might shift up the curve and lead to a higher wage at that population. But that means that the population is rising, right, because we have a higher wage, which means that we get pushed back down along the wage curve, and we end up with a permanently higher population but a lower wage, right? And so really the question is, is the increase in productivity something that is temporary, right? We just had a good harvest because of good weather. Maybe we had 3 or 4 or 5 years of good weather in a row, and so population went up. But then we have 5 years of bad weather and population goes back down. Or did it increase because of a new technology, in which case it would be permanent, in which case we'd have a permanently higher population, but the wage is going to fall back to subsistence anyway. And so we can see this, Britain is one of the places where we have pretty good data going back all the way to the 13th century. And we can see that after the Black Death in the 1340s, population fell, right? Average real wage went up, which makes sense because the Black Death didn't do anything to the land or to capital, right? So now these workers were more productive, their wage went up, and their wage went up by a lot, right? So look at, the difference between the 1350s and the 1490s. This is a real wage index, meaning we're comparing it to 1860, which is equal to 100. In the 1350s, it was only about 60% of the wage in 1860, but by the 1490s, it was over 90% of the 1860 wage. But then, right, so now we're at a high point of real wage and low population, but now population starts to recover, right? The bubonic plague is controlled, the bubonic plague leaves, and we move back down the curve. So in the 16th century, moving back down, and by the 1600s, right, we're not any better off than we were in the 1340s before the bubonic plague. We have the same number of people back again, and the wage is exactly the same. So it really looked like we were in this Malthusian trap, and there was no way to escape it. And so we can see, what happened here in this time frame, between 1300 and 1600. We had this horrendous event of the Black Death, which wiped out a huge amount of the population all over Europe after coming from China, where it did a very similar thing. That meant that there was more and better land for farmer. It also meant that peasants were more powerful. There was something called the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 that gave them some more rights, gave them some higher wages. Wages went up, right? So they reached a high, in the 1400s. But then as the population recovered and rose again, that meant there was less land for a farmer, and that the bargaining power for farmers and peasants fell, and incomes basically went back to where they were before the Black Death. So why are we sometimes stuck in the Malthusian trap? Well, there are sort of three required conditions. One is the diminishing average product of labor, which we already talked about, right? The fact that as you add more workers, the average product of labor falls. The other is that you get a rising population in response to increases in wages, and we explain that by saying, listen, this was, before the healthcare revolution, more food meant healthier people. That meant people were going to survive more. That meant an increase in population. And an absence of improvements in technology that would offset the diminishing average product of labor. So the way we're going to think about technology is not that we move along, that the shape of the production function changes, but that it shifts up. And so really these new technologies that were introduced in the Industrial Revolution allowed people to escape the Malthusian trap by just producing so much more. And as we'll see, population sort of responded in a different way, right? So that now people, as they get richer, have fewer children rather than more children. So really the escape from the Malthusian trap, you can say, production sort of started increasing in the middle of the 17th century, but wages didn't really start increasing until the 19th century. But you can see that from about 1800 to 1860, wages increased by 40 to 50%, going from 72% of what they were in 1860 to 100%, obviously by 1860. So another interesting question is, all right, well, if production increased starting in around 1650, why didn't wages increase until around 1800, right? And they didn't really start increasing quickly until 1830, 1840. And this is where institutions really become important. And so as productivity increases, workers are producing more and more, right? So we start moving from farms to factories. Farms are producing more, factories are producing more. And now that means that workers are able to demand more, their bargaining power increases, they're able to pass some laws such as no child labor under 10 years. Eventually, we get rid of child labor, limit the amount of time they can work. We get voting rights for all men, then we get voting rights for all people, and that allows people to capture more of what they are producing, right? Which hadn't been happening in the previous 200 years.